This week, we're talking about developmental psychology. And no individual psychologist is more important to understanding development than Jean Piaget. He was a Swiss psychologist, and he developed a theory of cognitive development, how we develop thought and how we interact with the environment. Cognitive development. Now, most observations that he made about cognitive development were on his own 3 children. So he wasn't the greatest scientist in the world, but he's had profound impact on both psychology and education. Now, he believed that cognitive development occurred in stages, and that was a very popular theory in his period of time. The first stage was a sensory motor stage from birth to 2 years, then the pre-operational stage from 2 to 7, and then concrete operational stage from 7 to 11, and then after 11, the formal operational stage. Now let's look at those individually. First, the sensory motor stage. In the sensory motor stage, the child knows the world through its senses and acts to perform on the world. In other words, only what is available in the sensory processes of the child is it able to deal with. This wasn't part of his theory, but I want to point out that even in this very early stage of life, these children can be conditioned. For example, infants like to see things moving, and if you put a mobile on the crib and then attached a light so that when the child moved its legs, the light would interact with the leg and cause the mobile to move, pretty soon that child is really flashing its legs because it really wants to see movement. So it can be conditioned, even at this early stage, to perform. Now, in the sensory motor stage, in the first 4 months, the child is just learning to grasp, just learning eye-hand coordination, and there's no object permanence. What that means is if the object's in where they can sense it, then they believe it's a part of their world. But if it's taken away, it doesn't exist. Only things that exist are things that they can see or hear or touch. If they have object permanence, which we'll see in a later stage, then when you remove the object, it still has a representation of that object. From 4 to 8 months, it becomes interested in objects. It tries to reach for them, it tries to grab them, it tries to deal with them when they're in the environment, the sensory environment of the child. From 8 to 12 is where you start seeing object permanence. So if I take an object, a toy, let's say, the child is playing with, and put it behind a card, it sort of knows that it's still there even though they can't see it. Even though they can't sense it, they have some idea that it's still there. And I remove the card, they'll see it again. And then from 12 to 18 months, the child actively explores the environment to look for objects when they're not there. So you sort of see crude hypothesis testing. For example, if I put the card in front of the toy, the child will try to look behind the card to see the toy. It understands that the object is still there. Sensory motor. And then from 18 to 24, 2 years of age, it starts making inferences about objects that it has experienced but might not be present in the environment. Now this is really important because the child is learning that they can have representations of objects, and that's very important for cognitive development. In the pre-operational stage, from 2 to 7, the child is developing language. So it really is developing a conceptual way in which to think about its world. And it fully can represent objects and events when they're not present. In the concrete operational stage, from 7 to 11, now the child is beginning to have complex manipulations of representations of concrete objects because it has language and is able to do that. And it can classify objects into categories and hierarchies. For example, it might see a dog and have a concept of dog, a representation of what a dog is, but it might, in a very early part of its development of categories, say that all four-legged creatures are dogs, but then it sees a cat, and mom says, no, that's not a doggy, that's a cat. It starts developing new categories and new hierarchies, ways of representing objects. And then it, for the first time, shows conservation of quantity, mass, volume. In other words, let me just show you an example of what a conservation task might look like. We might have two cylinders filled with water, and I take one of the cylinders and I pour it into another cylinder so it looks like that. And then I ask the child which cylinder has more water in it. Even though it saw that I poured from one cylinder to the other, it will always pick the tall one. It doesn't have conservation of mass or conservation of volume. It simply looks at which one is taller. And this is important because it shows that the child can make inferences about the manipulation that I made. And it could be with number, it can be with size, it can be with anything that I can manipulate, but the child still will think if I take 5 coins and spread them out over a larger area, then it would say that has more coins in it than the 5 coins over a smaller area, or the conservation of volume that you see here. The Piaget's theory has some processes that are very important. First, this idea of cognitive development being a representational acquisition. In other words, the child acquires schemas, these categories in which to place things. A cognitive structure or pattern by which we organize the world through schemas or schemata. Now, he does that in 2 ways. First, as assimilation. We incorporate our experiences of the world into existing schemas. So if I learn that all 4-legged animals, cats, dogs, zebras, are mammals, then I might develop that hierarchy through assimilation, taking new objects and bringing them in to existing schemas. Or I can create new schemas or change schemas when necessary. So when I find that a zebra is not really a horse, but a separate category, then I develop a new, through accommodation, I develop a new category of zebras, which is different from horses. So it's a constant changing of the schemas that we have and adding new schemas or changing schemas or adding new objects into existing schemas that allows cognitive development to occur. It allows us to organize the world in meaningful ways through a use of language. So cognitive development, according to Piaget, is a continual process of assimilating as long as possible and accommodating by making new schemas. And that's how we develop cognition. One other task that's very important is sort of the idea that before we are able to take other people's perspectives, our perspective is the thing. And he developed this mountain task where he stood with a child in front of a sort of a plastic mountain and then showed the child pictures of the mountain from different perspectives and says, which one is my perspective? The child, when it's egocentric, would always pick his own perspective, looking at the mountain from his height, not from the height of the experimenter. So, Piaget's theory has had certain kinds of challenges since it was developed. First, are the stages as discrete and as consistent as Piaget argued? No. The correspondence between the different tasks is really relatively low. It's important to know that these are the different ways in which the child can interpret their environment, but the actual correlation with stages is not as strong as Piaget would believe. If the egocentric task is made simpler, then the child, like flatter mountain, for example, then the child can actually, at a younger age, develop other people's perspectives as well as their own. And also, the conservation is present at younger ages if your test is just right, but it does not generalize with other conservation tasks until about 7, as Piaget suggested. So there have been some challenges to the theory, but it has also been a very important contribution to understanding development, especially development of cognition. Thanks.